Good morning. I want to introduce our study this morning by introducing you to a couple people in church history who I hope you already know. Do you all know William Tyndale? What was he famous for? Wow, yes. Okay, well, you already know this. He translated the Bible into English, but from the original languages. And so, as hard as that task is anyway, he did it at a time where even owning a copy of a translated portion of the Bible was a capital offense. And to be found translating the Bible into the vernacular, into English, was a death sentence. And so he was the first person not to translate into English, but to translate it from the original language. Wycliffe did it first, but it was translated from Latin, and it became, Tyndale's like, I don't want to play telephone with the Bible. So he fell under conviction in his adult life to translate the Bible into English. And as he did that, he asked the people at his university, will you help me in this task? And they say, no, we're not willing to do that. And so he chose to go about this, bringing in opposition from people that he expected, opposition from places that he didn't expect. And he starts this life work, and it became, nobody knows what Tyndale looked like. And they drew pictures of him after he died because he spent his life in back rooms and in corners and in hiding, trying to get this work done with no one to help him. And so I say that because he ended up at this really important house in history. He ends up in the Netherlands with most of the New Testament finished, and he's working through the Old Testament, or the New Testament is finished, he's working through the Old Testament, and he finds this house that was a home base for some British merchants. And he goes and he's staying in the back room. They're sympathetic to the Reformation, and they're helping him. Now, remember him there, and I want to introduce you to another character named Henry Phillips, who had everything that he needed to have a leg up in this world. His dad's a 3-time parliamentarian. He's got stacks of money. He's registered for a law degree from Oxford. He has everything he needs, but he also has some habits that are kind of hindering his life. And so his father gives him part of the family fortune to pay off a family debt in London, and when he gets there, he gambles it all away. And so some of the high-ups at the Catholic Church come to him, they hear about this, and they seek this as an opportunity against William Tyndale. And they come to him and they said, we will pay your gambling debts in full. It's like it never happened if you will bring us William Tyndale. And so this is a really cool story. We can't get into all of it. I just wanted to introduce it to you, and maybe you can go study it further on your own. But he finds out where Tyndale is. He moves into a local village. He starts befriending the people that live in this house, all of the merchants. He becomes friends with Tyndale, and he starts eating meals with them and sharing time with them. And one night, when there's only one person in the house who was skeptical of this guy, Henry Phillips, and one night he was gone, and so here comes Henry Phillips, and he says, Tyndale, let's go take a walk. And in these little Dutch villages and Dutch cities, the roads were very narrow, and they came to a place where the road was particularly narrow. It was only wide enough for one person to go through at a time. And Phillips says, Tyndale, why don't you, we're out enjoying the air. I insist, you go first. And he walks in, and just around the corner, there are some guards there ready to seize Tyndale. And nobody knows what he looks like, right? So he staged a betrayal. And the signal was, when I point at him, that will be the man, and that will be the time for you to arrest him. And so he points at Tyndale, and the guards come to arrest him, and he turns around to try and flee, and there is Phillips, and he shoves him into the arms of the guards, and they take him to prison, and that is his last moment of freedom. He spends 18 months in jail, goes through a religious and a civil trial, and he stays there in the cold doing as much work as he can until a heavy chain is brought, put around his neck, and he is strangled, burned, and blown up with gunpowder. And remember that, because this is going to be the legacy of the Bible that you hold in your hands, and we're going to come back to him. But I introduce Tyndale to you to show you that there's a lot of parallels between his life and the life of Jesus. He was like Jesus. Tyndale spent his life running from opposition. Not that Jesus did that, but there's just a life of opposition. Like Jesus, Tyndale was betrayed by a friend, a close friend. Like Jesus, Tyndale had to go through a civil and a religious trial. And like Jesus, Tyndale died for what he stood for. And so this is relevant to you because the message hasn't changed. You have the same Bible that he had. You have this Bible because of the work that he did. And the world hasn't changed. The message hasn't changed, and they haven't changed. And maybe we should dispel a myth right now that the world's out there neutral to the things of God, just waiting to be won, waiting to hear the message. And in a sense, yeah, they are, but they're hostile to this. The world hates our message. They like the fruit of us. They like when we take care of the widows and the orphans, and they like when we do things in our community, but they hate our message, and that has never changed. And so if you want to know if the world is opposed to you, just preach a little bit about what Tyndale preached. You want to know what he died for? We have the official list of the charges that were brought against him off the Catholic registry. Are you ready for them? Number 1, maintaining salvation is by faith alone. Number 2, maintaining that belief in the forgiveness of sins and embracing the mercy offered in the gospel is enough for salvation. Number 3, believing that the human will is bound by sin. Number 4, affirming that the Virgin Mary and the dead saints do not pray for us. Number 5, affirming that we do not need to pray to Mary or the dead saints to be heard by Christ. Number 6, denying there is such a thing as purgatory. And for this, there's nothing left of William Tyndale to even bury or to even dig up. And so if you think things have changed, just preach the message of the gospel. Salvation is by faith alone, through Jesus Christ and his work alone. And that'll give you a lifetime of opposition. And if you need some more, just go to Genesis. Jesus, God, created the world. They'll find that offensive. Genesis 1:27, he created them male and female in the image of God. They'll find that offensive. Go to Genesis 2:24, a man will leave father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they will become one flesh. And you haven't even got through to chapter 3, and you've already got enough opposition to last you a lifetime. This message is offensive. And so opposition came to Jesus. Opposition came almost in the same way to Tyndale, and in the same way opposition is going to come to you, because nothing has changed. The message hasn't changed. The mission field hasn't changed. And as you turn today, we're going to look at Luke. We're going to start in Luke 21, and we're going to get to Luke 22. And James Wilder is taking the day off down here. He has asked me to preach on the opposition to Jesus, which there's a whole book on that. It's called the Bible, right? You can't, in one time, in 20 minutes, 30 minutes, preach on the opposition to Jesus. When he was born, before he even turned 2, people already wanted to kill him. He couldn't even talk yet, and they already wanted him dead. His own family opposed him, didn't they? His brothers didn't believe in him until after he died and was resurrected. His friends betrayed him. Peter opposed him to his face. Judas betrayed him. His whole life was a life of opposition. And spoiler, he is your model. And the servant is not unlike the master. And so what Jesus does in Luke 21, or what he does through the mouth and the pen of Luke, is he shows you the kind of opposition that you're going to face. And so what we're going to do this morning is we're going to focus not on all of the opposition of Jesus, but we're going to look at kind of this critical moment when all of the different opposition begins working in concert to bring Jesus to his arrest and ultimately to his crucifixion. And that's where James will pick up next week. But in Luke 21, he tells us the kinds of opposition that we're going to face. And so we're going to look at opposition from a whole bunch of different angles. But the first one is Jesus foretells about opposition. And he tells you this so that you're not surprised by it when it comes. But you might be surprised in reading this by where it comes. Look in chapter 21, chapter 21, beginning in verse 15. Starting halfway through the paragraph, "For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You will be delivered up even by parents and brothers and sisters and relatives and friends. And some of you they will put to death. You will be hated by all for my name's sake, but not a hair of your head will perish. By your endurance you will gain your lives." So Jesus is looking into the future, but this is true now. This is true of Tyndale. This is true of people in our own lives. And what Jesus is telling you, the places that you're going to find opposition, is the same places that he found opposition. So it's almost prophetic in what he was talking about, because he's talking about himself and what he was going to do. And so where can you expect to find opposition? You don't just find it from what you would expect. You don't just find it from the atheists and those hostile to Jesus Christ and those of other religions. You find it from your own family. Your brothers and sisters will deliver you over. Your friends, your neighbors. Those are the kinds of places that you can expect opposition. And so here's the message. Don't be surprised when it comes, because you've been told beforehand. And Jesus, your great high priest, your great example, paved the way for you, and he shows you how to handle opposition, and he shows you where it comes from. And so when you're lamenting that you're pouring yourself out, and you're lamenting, God and Christ, I'm so tired. I always do the right thing, and I'm always trying to act on behalf of the church, and all I get is persecution and opposition and death. Nobody says thank you. Jesus has already walked that path, and he can listen to you because he is a high priest who can sympathize with your groanings. We have a high priest who can sympathize with our condition. And so that's why I introduced Luke 21, because in Luke 22, there's all these little narratives sprinkled in where Luke wants to show you the kinds of opposition that Jesus faced. And I want to look just briefly, look at chapter 22, beginning in verse 1. Let's see what kinds of opposition he faced. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. So first, just really short paragraph here. Who wants Jesus dead? The chief priests and the scribes. So the religious mucky-muck, always. Their power is threatened, their money is threatened, their position is threatened, and so they want Jesus dead. So now you've got the religious people wanting him dead. Let's look at verse 3. Then Satan entered into Judas, called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12, and he went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad, and they agreed to give him money. So he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him in the absence of a crowd. It's amazing the kind of power that money can have over people, isn't it? It's the same thing that came with Tyndale. So they seek, you're looking at Passover, where it was one of the pilgrimage feasts, and so you have upwards of 200,000 or more people coming into Jerusalem. And so you want to find Jesus? Good luck, right? What happens after the festival's over? The people all go out to the Mount of Olives. They're all going to the countryside. They're all going out to the hills. So how are they going to find Jesus? And that's what they're talking about when they're in this meeting. And who walks in, maybe even into their very meeting while they're talking about this? Satan enters Judas. And I find it interesting as an aside that the two of them together, it still calls him he. Satan dwells in Judas, who already wanted to betray him, who was already seeking a means to betray him, and then Satan enters him, and all hope of any goodness in him is gone. And they needed a means, the scribes and the chief priests needed a means to find Jesus, and here comes Judas walking probably into their very meeting, saying, I will do it. What will you give me for it? And so here you find the opposition beginning to work together. And you see they were glad. They offer him money. They offered him reward in their joy. And they consent and seek an opportunity to betray him in the absence of a crowd so that he might be put to death. Skip ahead, and it cuts to the scene of Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper and with his disciples. And I want to skip over that just for a moment to come to verse 39 as we look again to the types of opposition that Jesus faced. And he came out and went, as was his custom, that little phrase is important, to the Mount of Olives. And the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, pray that you may not enter into temptation. And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt and prayed, saying, Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, and strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And so I think you can count this as opposition because Jesus' own body, the weakness of his own human nature, was working against him. Nobody wants to suffer and to die. Even God himself. He does for the reward, but he doesn't for the pain and all that he's going to have to endure. And so you see, even you have Satan working against him and the religious elites, and as you're going to see, the world and the Romans are coming against him, and his own flesh is coming against him. And you're going to see when he hits the cross, Isaiah 53 says that it pleased God to crush him. And so you have his own Father turning against him. And so all of this opposition comes, verse 44, verse 45. he rose from prayer and he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Rise and pray that you may not enter into temptation." And while he was speaking, there came a crowd. And I'm of the persuasion that this was a great multitude of 600 or more men. The man called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He drew near to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said, "Judas, would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" And when those who were around him saw what would follow, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" One of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "No more of this." And he touched his ear and he healed him. And Jesus said to the chief priests and the officers of the temple and elders who had come out against him, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." This is your hour and the power of darkness. And so Luke sets the scene because this is a critical moment in the life of Jesus. He goes where he knows Judas is going to come, and he kneels down to pray, and the scene is set. So the scene is you are at the south of Jerusalem, and you're looking on, and there is the beautiful gate in Jerusalem and the temple, and here comes the power of darkness. Here comes the army led by Judas, inhabited by Satan, coming down into the Kidron Valley as if marching to war. And then over here on the east, you have Jesus standing by himself, praying earnestly to God. He's telling his disciples, "Please pray with me." He can see, right? This is the brightest night of the year. He can see this army marching toward him. He can hear them coming toward him. And he says, "Please stay awake and pray with me." He's only a half mile away. And so there, the light of the world stands by himself against the army that is marching against him. And there's a very unusual display that happens, isn't there? What happens when all of the opposition working in concert, coming together against Jesus, they march up toward him, and what happens? Jesus steps up to confront them, and he says, "Whom do you seek?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am." And they all fall on their backs, and they stand up again, and he says, "Who do you seek?" And they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am." And they all fall over again, and I recognize this week exactly what this is and why this is so powerful, because this is a preview of something that's coming in the future. This is a preview of Isaiah 11. In Isaiah 11, it says just before Jesus Christ comes, when he comes on his second coming and he's about to establish the millennial kingdom where we will reign with him for 1,000 years, it says that he is going to come and he's going to strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. And this is a preview of that day. And so this is the localized event where there's a little bit of opposition. Maybe there's 600 men, maybe there's less, maybe there's more, but there's a small army that's coming out against him. The men with clubs, that's the temple police. There's the men with swords, that's arguably the Roman legions coming after him, or the Roman cohort coming after him, and the mob that they've gotten. This little localized event. They come up to him on the Mount of Olives, and he strikes them with the rod of his mouth. With a word, they fall over. And Peter gets out his sword to cut off Malchus's ear. We know it was Peter. And Jesus says, "Not that sword and not this time. The place is right, but the timing is wrong, because there's a day in the future." Isaiah 11 prophesied about it, and we read in Revelation 19, there's an eschatological event. It's going to be, the way is going to be prepared for it. The angels, when they're pouring out the bowls of God's wrath in the final plagues, one of the bowls is on the river Euphrates. And it says that the river dries up to make room for all the kings from all the nations to come and encamp against Jesus. And this will be the final opposition. And they will go to the valley of Har-Megiddo, what we call Armageddon, and all of the opposition and all of the wicked men will come against Jesus. And it says on that day, he doesn't come riding on the foal of a donkey. He comes riding on a white horse, and his robe is dipped in blood. And there is written on his thigh and on his cloak a name that is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And he will tread the winepress of the wrath and the fury of God. And it says that out of his mouth will come the word of God. And it says again, he will strike the nations with the sword of his mouth. And on that day, no one will stand. And David Houghton, on that day, and Jamie Hembry, the phasers will not be set to stun. Right? So this time, he's showing you there's opposition And by the way, for you all, opposition is real. Their power is a very real power, but it has no lasting power against the decrees of our eternal God, the power of Jesus Christ and his resurrection. There is no power. They can hurt you, they can come against you, but as Jesus said and prophesied in Luke 21, not a hair of your head will be hurt. And so in that global eschatological event, Jesus is showing them, I'm submitting myself to this opposition, but darkness does not overpower the light. You come against me. So the opposition against, I don't want to say is nothing, but he relents to it. And the reason is in verse 53, you did not lay hands on me when I was with you day after day, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. And so you see here the greatest army that darkness can muster here, and they will fulfill their task for now. But I want to show you a couple things about the opposition as well, because there's a number of things that you can look at when you focus on the opposition here. This is arguably Jesus, the hour of his greatest distress. He's sitting in a garden. His disciples are asleep. He's by himself, and he's watching an army march against him, and he knows where he's going. It's already said. He knows exactly what's going to happen to him. That's why the drops of blood are there, and the pressure is on as the brightest night of the year as this army comes against him. And here in this situation, you and I would be concerned with one person, and that would be ourselves, and we would get out of there. You can see the power of Jesus. Number one, he knows where Judas is going to go, and so he places himself strategically there, which is a powerful enough thought in itself. But it says that even in that critical moment, he was not concerned with his own life. He was concerned with the will of God. And so he prays, remove this cup from me, verse 41. Nevertheless, not my will, Lord, but yours. So he's not concerned with himself. He's concerned with the will of God. And number two, he's not concerned with himself. He's concerned with his disciples. So these men come against him, and he says, whom do you seek? And he's literally asking you, you have a certificate in your hand for arrest. Whose name is written on the head of that piece of paper? Who do you have the authority to arrest? Who are you here for? And they say, we're here for Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I am. Therefore, let my disciples go. And they fall down and stand back up. And then he says again, who are you here to arrest? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And he's looking out for his disciples. He says, I am he. Now let these men go. And so your high priest had his disciples in mind. Even when he was going to die, he cared enough for them to protect them so that they could be saved. And not only the will of God, not only the disciples, but you. Why was he going to the cross in the first place? Because of his love for you. And so he willingly submitted himself to the hour and the power of darkness, because that was the agreed upon decree. Jesus would go to the cross to die to save the church. And so he submitted himself to that so that he could purchase you and purchase the church. He was not concerned with himself. He was concerned with the church. I think the opposition served one other purpose. It showed that only one person could stand that kind of opposition. There was only one person who could stand in the hour of darkness against all that opposition, and it was Jesus. So what the opposition did was it began to peel away all of the followers. What Jesus had to do, he had to do alone, didn't he? So the persecution, the opposition, he was already left down to 12, and arguably maybe a couple others. So as he goes to the garden, he's with his disciples, and then they're already beginning to be weak. They're asleep. They're already showing, if you want to read yourself into the story and see where you are, you're asleep over there while Jesus prays and watches the army marching in. So the opposition comes, and the disciples flee. He protects them, and they flee. And then there's a little bit in Mark, you know, that the story where there's a guy out there, and the army reaches out, and they grab his cloak, and then he runs away naked. You know that story that I'm talking about? If you want to read yourself into the story, that's you. And why is that story in there? It's one of the weird quirks of the Bible. I think it's in there to show whoever was with Jesus is gone. The disciples fled. His followers fled. Even Peter denied him and fled. Even the one guy who was with him, apparently on the periphery, ran away naked and afraid. Everybody is gone. That's what the opposition did, and this was to fulfill Leviticus 16, because the great high priest didn't get help. He wasn't allowed help. What happened on the Day of Atonement in Leviticus? The tent of meeting is vacated. Even the chief priests and the Levites, they're gone. The people are gone. They're not allowed to be in there. And the high priest goes in and he does all of the sacrificial work of atonement himself. The goat of Azazel, the putting the sins on the people, that was the high priest. The people were allowed to look on and watch. And he would send him out in the wilderness, that was him. The sacrificial goat and the bull, that was him. Going into the Holy of Holies, he was allowed in there one time a year. He did that by himself. And actually, if you go back and read Leviticus 16, it tells you the role of the people. What role did they play in this process? They put on sackcloth and ashes, and they weep and mourn over their sin, because it was their sin that demanded that atonement anyway. And so if you want to know, again, what role you play in your own salvation and that atonement, it is the sin that put Jesus there. And so what is your role in salvation? It's to weep and mourn over your sin and to fall on Jesus Christ as your salvation. Because the work that he did, redemption, atonement, he did it alone. And what does John 18 tell us? What does Luke 22 tell us? What does Matthew 26 tell us? If we were there, we would have fallen away too. Nobody had the strength to do it except the light of the world, and that was Jesus. And so the work that Jesus did, he had to do alone, but the work that you have a help. You don't have to do it alone. I want to pick back up with Tyndale and Phillips, because there was another person who came to live in that little British merchant house, and his name was John Rogers. I got to be careful just not to preach a whole sermon right now on John Rogers, because he's an incredible story in church history. But he comes to this house, finds Tyndale. Tyndale converts him, and he begins helping him on his work of translating the Bible. And he's at the house when Tyndale is going out to be betrayed, and he actually hears about the betrayal and the arrest of Tyndale. And before the guards can come back and confiscate all of his work, he gathers it all in a bundle and literally flees out the back door into the forest into the night, which is incredible. And he takes on the work of Tyndale. He finishes the Bible, publishes under the pseudonym Thomas Matthews, and it becomes known as the Matthews Bible, which is the first English Bible. And what's really cool is I want you guys to hold in your hands this English Bible. That's the legacy of what you hold. Those men brought this and made the way so that you can read and that we can preach out of this today, and you stand on their shoulders. And by the way, the King James Bible, when it was written, 83% of the language, at least of the New Testament, was identical to the Matthews Bible. They paved the way, but it wasn't just Tyndale, it was the church who came beside and helped him and continued his work. And John Rogers, too, it's just story after story, he died for it. And his martyrdom was an incredible story as well. It was a celebration. But when they martyred him, it was a lady by the name of Mary Tudor, and she got the name Bloody Mary because John Rogers was the first person that she burned at the stake. And the people that were watching him cheered him on. They said it was so beautiful. They thought they mistaked it for his wedding day. They said if you didn't know what was happening, you would have thought he was going to his wedding. And that's the church. We help each other. There's one person you can rely on, and your family is important. Friends are important. They are gifts from God, but there's something special about the church, isn't there? The work that Jesus did, he did alone, but the work the church did, he gave us help. And so this is our refuge. The people that are around you, on the day that I'm martyred and on the day that you're martyred, you're going to be the people that are up there with me. I'm going to be the guy up there with you, or if not, I'm going to be the guy that's down there cheering you on. The work that Christ did, he did alone. But the work that we do, embrace each other as the church, and let's look to Christ for our salvation. Will you all pray with me this morning? Lord God, you are all-powerful. You are mighty to save. We love you. We thank you that you would accomplish the work of redemption for us. You were the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. And you came here, you demonstrated your power over the opposition 2,000 years ago, and we look forward to the day, Lord, when you will come again and wipe out the wicked, slaughter the wicked, so that your church can reign with you forever. No opposition. The lion will be with the lamb. The child will put his hand over the snake's den and will not be hurt. There will be no more mourning and no more tears. There will just be fellowship and communion with you, the Lamb who was slain. God, may that day come quickly and strengthen us for the work that you have. When opposition comes, may we not be surprised, but may we lean on the tools that you've given us, which is the church. Thank you for the church, Lord, and thank you for your work. We ask all this in Christ's name. Amen.